the infamous 4B, but in order to solve 4B, we do have to kind of solve 2B and 3B in the process of it. So we're just going to follow the instructions, right? We're going to do it as it says. So the first one, it says study the SQL query below. And so if we look at that query, it has 5 statements: a select statement, where we're taking a scheme name, right? And steps, all steps. We are going to take a from, right? We're going to do a left join, where we take the steps and we join those with scheme ID from scheme, the step ID. So we're connecting those two and we want those to match. We're going to do a where statement that's going to define our get, because in this particular instance, we're doing find by ID. So we need some method, which is the scheme ID here. And then lastly, we're just going to order it, ascending. All right. So when you have a grasp on this query, go ahead and build it. Connects. And instead of a literal line 41, we want to use scheme ID. And let's see, I think this is test in Postman, just make sure that we're getting it back. It looks like this. Now I won't be using Postman. I never use Postman. I use Insomnia normally, although when we're doing like the live coding, I use this one. It's called Thunder Client, just because it opens in the tab right here. So you can see I went ahead and built my schemes. So schemes is currently working, because we need that in order to, and I just lost my mouse. There it is. This battery's going low. Plug that in. Okay. So we're going to literally translate this into JavaScript. So we'll come down here. You couldn't do it up in here, but I like to keep my code separate from my comments. And we have to think about a couple of things. So we know we're going to be building some series of functions. And if we look at our previous question, so we're going to have a return statement here. But in this case, we're going to be, we know we're going to have functions, but we'll go ahead and start it in this method. So let's do it. All right, so we're going to say return. And what are we going to return? Now, this is an async function. And generally, we know to make sure that we use an async function because we're doing a database call. So we're going to be, so we can say await. And what do we want to do? Well, let's just start, right? We want to start with getting the database schemes as scheme, I think is what it said. So we can come up here, oops, scheme from schemes as scheme ID. So let's save this and let's go over here. This is a find by ID. So let's look at what we got. So already, as soon as we do that very few lines of code, we already have this. And the important thing with all development, but in this case, especially, build the least amount of code that you can and test it. Don't try to think through the entire problem. Do one piece, make it work, move to the next piece. All right, so we're getting a scheme ID and a scheme name, and we can already look at this. So we had an array, we have an object, we got a scheme ID and a scheme name. So we're already 2 out of 5 with the absolute one line of code. But it did tell us to do other things, right? So let's go to the next line. So we've got this, and the next line, of course, is that we want to, these kind of go together, right? So we want to do a left join, and we want to do a where and an order by. So we'll just do it in order. We'll say left join. So we'll do a left join. And it tells us to left join. I think I'd remember all these, but steps as ST, I remember that one. Steps is ST on scheme ID from scheme and scheme ID from steps. That's our foreign key, right? The scheme ID, that's the piece that connects these two tables together. So we can say we want to join from steps as steps, and we want scheme, make sure I put that in quotes, or scheme. I hate spelling scheme. I always get it wrong. So we want schemes, and from there we want the scheme ID. And then we also want what? We want steps, and we want the scheme ID from there as well. That's the foreign key. That's the one piece that both steps and schemes have together. And you can validate that, of course. You just go and check your database, right? So we'll save that. We'll go ahead and go to our next. Let's run it. Now look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Look at what we're supposed to get. Scheme ID 1, name world domination, step 2, number 1. Go over here and we look at this. All right, scheme 1, world domination, step 2, number 1, instructions. And then we have, so if we look at our code here, step 2, step ID, all right, step, scheme ID 3, step 8, right? So we have some oddness happening, but we've already got this structure. Now 2 lines of code. Right? But we want to continue because we need more things happening, right? And this is where we kind of have to work our way through because we're still brute forcing it, if you will. So we want to do what? Well, the next line says we want a where statement, where. And we say scheme ID. So now we can be able to isolate that scheme ID, not just pick anything. Because if you notice, right now, scheme ID 1, scheme ID 2, scheme ID 3, 6, right? We're getting every scheme ID. This structure is what it wants, but we're not actually just getting scheme ID 1. We're getting in everything. And so now we need that where selector so that we can ensure that we only have the one, and that was scheme ID, which is we're passed in right there. Okay, so let's save that. Let's go look at our code and run it. Okay, scheme ID 1, scheme ID 1. So now we're only getting scheme IDs of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. But now we look at our step number. We have step number 1 down here. We have step 2, right? They're not in order. So this is the last part that it wants us to do is order by step ID, and we want it to be ascending. Right? And so now we can come down here and say order by. And how do we want to order it? We want the step, and we want to use the step ID, right? Or the step number, I think is what it was. Yeah, step number. And how do we want that? Well, we want that to be ascending. So we go one more go around, and we fired it up. So we have scheme ID of 1, which matches step 1, 1, 2, 1, 3. And if we do another number, then of course we can test that. 2, 1, 2, 2. All right. So we have now completed this first section by doing exactly what they told us to. We didn't have to use any creativity whatsoever, right? And we have validated that we can use the scheme ID. We tested 1 and 2. And then we have also ensured that it follows this directive. We have the 5 pieces and they are in order. So we've done 1A, what is it? 1B, 2B, 3B, and now we have 4B. So if we take a look at what we have with 4B, and we look at what we are getting up here, right? Let's see. So we have a scheme ID already. We have a step name already, or a scheme name already. But where our steps are here, going in a new object every time, here we want to have an array that's named steps. And inside of the steps, we want step ID, step number, and instruction. So we want to keep these two where we have them, and we want to move these three into a new object that's inside of an array named steps. And so this is where we have to put some of our JavaScript to work. And the first thing that we have to do is we can no longer leave it in this structure, right? We have to get rid of this return because we're going to have other code below. And so we need to go ahead and make this a variable of some kind. So we'll say constant step info. And now, of course, if we save that and we run, we get nothing at 200. And that's why, because we're not returning that, right? So we can come down here and we can return step info. We'll save that, fire it up again, and we're back to working. Okay. So we just made that change so that we can add additional code in which to modify or do something else. So let's think this through. What do we need? We're going to need a new scheme of some kind. We're going to need a way to loop through our current code, right? So this, and we're going to need this, or a new, not scheme, I'm sorry, a new array, key value pair called steps. And that is going to have inside of it a scheme or something. I hate the name scheme. Ugh. So so useless. What's a scheme? Sounds like we're planning a big project or something. So we need to do some modification. Now, the next thing I'm going to write, it's not a requirement, but it's good JavaScript ownership. And that's some form of error handling. And this really will come into play on this 5B. So we have a situation where we could have an empty steps, right? Which means if we have something going on empty, we have to make sure we account for how that works and what errors can be thrown. Because remember, Node will crash if you don't properly handle errors, right? So let's do an if statement. We're gonna say if something is gonna happen, right? And if something happens, we're going to return something. So what happens that would throw an error or an issue? Well, if the step info is empty, right? That is going to be a problem, right? If it's empty, we don't want things to completely crash on us. So we can say if there is not, right, step info. So in other words, step info length is 0. So if there's no step info, then we can just return null. That way we don't crash. And in about 98% of the time, that's not going to come into play. But we want to make sure, since we already know ahead of schedule that we could have empty, we want to make sure that we compensate for that. Okay. So we have handled an error issue if there is no length. And the next question becomes, what do we need? Well, we know that we need to have an object that has, well, let's see this maybe like this. I think we can see everything. This object has three key value pairs: step ID, step number, and instructions. Now, those are available, right? But we want to create our own object with those three. And this is where I think just about everybody had such a hard time, was figuring out how to separate this object or make this object its own. And in reality, we just follow regular JavaScript. We just want to create a new object that has these three parts. So we want it to have a scheme ID, right? It's going to have something. We'll put a comma there for now. It's also going to have a scheme name, which will have something. And then it's going to have a, oops, wait, sorry, that's not scheme name. Looking at the wrong one. Step ID, step number, and instructions. That's the one to do. So this becomes step ID and step number and and instructions. Okay, so let's think about how those are going to work. And so we know that we're going to have this object that has those parts. And for now, let's look at what we have. So the step ID, what is the step ID? Well, the step ID is the scheme ID. Right? We need something in here. Oh, wait a minute. Do I have this wrong again? Step ID scheme. Let me look here. Oh, yeah, man, my brain is trash. Let me get this out for a second. And we're gonna make I'm just gonna put this right here. So our scheme, I was right to begin with, looks like this. Yeah, scheme ID, scheme name, and steps. Inside of that scheme is where we're going to build the object that has step ID, step number, and instructions. I made the text so big that I have to keep moving around, and I've moved where I'm at. So let's try this again. Scheme ID, then it's going to have a scheme name, and it's going to have steps, which is an array. So this is the structure that we want right here. Scheme ID, right? And then we're going to insert into this array this structure. So two parts. And if we wanted to do, I mean, we could really call this something other than scheme. It's kind of the one that Lambda School uses. But I mean, you could call it anything that would make more sense. And to me, almost anything would make more sense. So we're creating this object. And notice that the key part here is that we're creating a single object, right? See, here, we were creating an array of objects. Right? But these two final parts are only one object that has these three parts inside of it, which is, here's our array with those three parts. And our scheme ID is going to be our scheme ID. Now, there is a little trick with this that if you don't test it, you probably won't see right off the bat. So we'll skip that for a second. We know that the array here is going to have something else in. I'm going to comment these out as we'll be doing the test. And we have this scheme name. And where do we get the scheme name? This is, if we think this through, this is the scheme name. If we go and look at our information, We have an array of objects. There's a scheme name in each object. So each object is object 0, right? Because this is an array, an object, in this case, object 1. Right? So we have to figure out a way to get the step info and the scheme name. This becomes a situation of what? Of object notation, right? This is our, how do we get an object out of an array, an object key value? So we can start with the array, step info, because this step info is the name of our array, right? There's our array. And inside of that, we have this object. So, and we have a, what? A scheme name. Now, this is not going to work, but I want you to see what happens when we run it. So we get the exact same thing that we had before, right? And why does that work? Well, because we're not actually calling that information, right? But if we were to run a console log right here, and we said scheme, so now I'm going to send, and we look at our console log, we get back an object with scheme ID. Scheme ID. This is really important. We'll look at this in a second. Scheme name is identified and steps. So this is almost the structure that we want. So, right, because if we come back up here and we say scheme ID, scheme name and steps, which looks an awful lot like this empty version, right? With one exception, this right here. So this is a string, right? We need to convert that to a number because we're going to be doing sorting and other things. It's a number. So, and then we have to figure out why we're getting undefined here. Do you know why we're getting undefined? Well, the reason we're getting undefined is because we have more than one object inside of our array, but we're not specifying. And so we can say, if we make this an object, note space, right? A spot, where is that at? We say 0, and we run that. Now we're getting a scheme name because now we have picked one array object, right? So in the array, we picked the 0 spot, and we said, what's that scheme name? And that should tell you then we're going to have an issue. If we're only picking one spot and we have multiples, we're going to have to do some kind of loop, right? We're going to have to loop it somehow, but we still got to deal with this scheme name or scheme ID. So there are a couple of ways that you can do this. One that you'll see often is like this, where you put parentheses around it and you declare it as a number. So if we run it again, we now have a number. Personally, I'm a firm believer in write the least amount of code that we can. And so I'm going to go with this method. Put a plus sign in front of it, and you run it, and it will turn a string into a number. There are other ways to do it as well. This happens to be my favorite. But you can also, if we did, and say number and scheme ID. Oops. And that is the scheme ID. So at this point, our scheme now looks exactly like this, which is pretty good. Now we've solved 5b mostly, right? But because we're not returning that, but we've solved how to make it look like that, but we still have this issue of the steps. And this should tell us. So we've already established that if we have multiple objects inside of the array and we're only taking one position, 0 index, that we're going to have to do what? We're going to have to loop. So we know we have a loop coming up. And we also know that if we are trying to put stuff into an array inside of a loop, we're going to have a push. That's the two parts to this process. We need to, I'm going to grab this out of here. So we have to, loop, because we have multiple objects inside of our array that we want one piece out of, and then we want to add pieces from that into an array, which is a push. So you can do several different kinds of loops. In this case, generally, I prefer a for each if given the chance, but you could use any loop that you want. Use one that you're comfortable with. Now, a for each takes a callback. And in this case, what are we making? Well, we're going to end up making these steps, right? Because we've already made the scheme object. So we already have that built. So I'm just going to say that what we're going to iterate through is a step. And then we have a loop. So we know that we're going to iterate through all of the pieces of the array called step information, which is here. Each time that we go through it, we are going to grab the scheme ID, the step information, the scheme information, and add our steps. So because we're saying the 0 spot, we know we're only going to grab one each time, right? So it's going to be our loop. So we can start with that. So we want to take our scheme and we want to build it. And so JavaScript tells us that inside of a loop, we can take our object, which is our scheme. We want to then take the steps that's inside of our scheme, because that's going to be an array. And we can't push to an object this way, right? We can push to an array. So there we go. We can take our scheme here, our steps, and our push, because that's an array, right? That's our JavaScript. And when we do that, we have to decide, what do we want to push? Well, what do we want to push? We want to push an object that looks like this. So let's make our object. We're going to push our object. And inside of that object, we have step ID, step number, and instructions. So let's see if I can remember that this time. Step ID, that's going to be a key value pair. We'll come back to that. Step number. Come on. Popping all that up there. I appreciate it's trying to help me, but in this case, and instructions. I think it's plural. Yes. Step number, step ID, instructions. Step ID, step number, and instructions. So now, where or how do we define our step ID? If we take the step, that's what we're iterating by, and we want what? We want the step ID. So we are going through our step information. We want this step ID. So that becomes the ID. It's right here. Right? So step ID is equal to step, which is our iterator, step ID. Step number is going to be the same thing. We're going to take our step, and out of that step, we are going to take our step number. And instructions will be the same thing. Out of that step, remember, this step is each one of these objects inside of the array. So we step ID, step number, and instructions. So now we have our scheme. We'll look at it one more time. That has our ID and our scheme name. Inside of the steps, we're going to, as we loop through each one of those, we're going to grab out step ID, step number, and instructions, and push them as an object inside of here. And that is almost done. Right? Now, we want to take a look at that, right? And this becomes kind of the last proverbial hurdle. And that is going to be, so right now we're returning step info, but what we really want is to return everything that's in the scheme with all of our steps. So we're going to remove this for a minute. And if we look at our structure, we are returning an object, right? So let's do that. Let's return an object. And with object notation, of course, and the other cool objects, we have the spread operator. So the spread operator tells us what? It tells us that we take each piece that we have as we go through it, right? Because we're updating it here, and we add it to our object. So let's save that and take a look. So notice that we have exactly what we're looking for. Scheme ID, right, of 2. That scheme name is Get Rich Quick. That has the steps array that has step of 5 with or step ID of 5 with a step number 1, the instructions step ID of 4 with a step number of 2, right? So the step ID, this can be in a different order because we are sorting by step number, right? That's, we decided we wanted to sort ascending by step number. So collect all the sheep in Scotland and then make a profit. So these steps were probably added in a particular order outside of what we're looking for. But if we come back over here and we say, let's go to 1 because that's the example they give us. So we have world domination, solve number, prime number theory, crack cybersecurity. Solve prime number theory, crack cybersecurity. And that is exactly what we have here. We have one issue though. When we go to our 5B, we had this looking like this, but we want to test it. So let's go to 7 and see what happens. So remember, we said if there's no length, return null. Well, there's no length, so it's returning null. Now, this is not the most important thing, right? But it's still ugly. If you're rendering on the front end, you want to be able to say if steps equal 0, if length is 0, I don't want to do anything. If it's 1 or greater, then I want to render. And then you're like, well, wait a minute, I rendered it, there's nothing there. Right? So that's a bad structure for the for your front end. Right? So you see why that's a bad issue, right? We never want to return anything that's empty, because then your front end is going to have to figure out how to deal with that. So we want to say, hey, wait a minute, if this array only has null, then we don't want anything to show up. And so we have to decide how we're going to handle the steps. Well, we already know that it's the steps issue, right? Because even if those are empty, we still want it to show up the rest of it. So we can say steps. So this is our object, right? So this is everything that's in the scheme. This is all the pieces, but we want to say if the steps is empty, do something else. And this is where a filter works the best, I think. So we can say scheme.steps, right? And what do we want to do? We want to filter. And remember, filter takes a callback, and we can just say, step. And if the step dot what? If the step ID, right, we can just work with this. If it is what? We want to filter out whether there's step with a step ID. So if there's no step ID, we want it to do nothing or filter that out, and we only want it to return where there is a step ID. And so now it says, hey, wait a minute, there's no step ID. You filtered those out, you get an empty array. Now we can go back to 1 and double check that we still have the same. That looks good. Try 2. Looks good. And 7 is empty. And that is how we solve that. Question?
Yeah, still need to rewatch it, I think.
You have to, the key to this one, and the key to all of it, is to break it down to pieces. This is a miserable one if you try to think it through from the top. Say, well, I'm going to need this, 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 and this. And that's tough. But if you do it in pieces, it's not as bad. Because here we, remember line 1 or line 96, we already had the bulk of it figured out. And by line 2 or 97, we had 3B done. But we had to be able to pick an ID. So we added one more line. Okay, we need to pick an ID. What's the last thing? Oh, now we need the sorting. So we did that. That part's done. And because we looked at the instructions first, we knew we were going to have an empty array situation. And when you have an empty array, or if something is empty, we want to go ahead and be able to handle that. Right? We want to be good netizens. We want to make sure we're following good procedure. We can do that. Then we look at it and we say, well, this is an object. It's a single object, and it has 3 parts. part 1, part 2, part 3. These are already part of the database call. So we can make our scheme. And the scheme is just the structure of how we want our object to look. That's all it is. Now, we could actually write that inside of our for each if we wanted to, or somebody was using a reducer, you could write it inside of a reducer, but that's tough. Man, that is rough, right? We only needed to do two things. We needed to keep the structure that we want, an object with 3 parts, and we want to have an array that we can do something with. So we built that. When we ran it without the location, we got an undefined here. And it makes sense because there are multiple objects inside of the array. And if we don't pick one, then it won't know what to do. And we always want 0 because right off the bat, we say, wait a minute, we have multiple things inside of an array. We're going to need a loop. And when we loop through them one at a time, 0 is always going to be the one that's there, right? And what do we want from that? Well, we want the scheme name from there. Now, if we wanted something else, right? If we wanted something else from there, if we also wanted, well, there's nothing else in there. But if we had in there also like maybe country, scheme country, right? So say that was in between right here, then we could also grab that by saying scheme country : step info 0 dot scheme country, and that would add that to our return object. This scheme is the object we want it to look like. And because of this, because of knowing that there are multiple things inside of there, we know we're going to have to loop. Now we created our loop. That's why we have a 0, because we know we're looping. Or we have a, that's the easiest way to look at it. And so then I used for each. You could do for loop. I mean, for each or for loop would be the best two options. But for each allows us to pick what we want to name it, right? This is the name of everything that happens inside of here only. We could call this ST, we could call this Bob, it doesn't make any difference because it's only inside of this for each function. And we want to go through our scheme, right? And our steps. This is the array that we're trying to do. So that's just object notation, scheme.steps. We're going to push. And when we go through it every single time of our steps, we want to grab these 3 things. And we know that we want those 3 things because they told us. Once that gets pushed into this array and it's looped all the way through, we can then return this object with the spread operator. So it just takes each one every time it goes through and it returns that whole group of it to us, which gives us this. But then when we realized we have an empty array, we get those ugly 3 nulls in there. We said, well, we don't want that. So what we want to do is we want to filter where scheme.steps, where there is a step ID. Now, there's 3 things in here, right? We could say, well, step ID has a step number. And let's do number 1. We got the exact same thing. Or we could say where there is an instruction, right? Because all we're doing is saying, if it has something in one of these 3 things, we want to keep it. Otherwise, don't worry about it. For me, makes the most sense to do the first one, but ultimately it doesn't matter. And that will return or filter those that have the step ID and attach that and continue through. So it will always display the scheme and it only affects steps. So if there's nothing there, it just returns us our default, which is an empty array. Did that second go through help any?
Yeah. Now understand better. Thank you.
All right, let me stop this recording.